Well, the state had rested its case in chief. We'll now begin with the defense presentation of its case. Excuse me. Mr. Wood, you can call your first witness.
Thank you. Dr. Mark Mills.
Dr. Mills, if you'll take the witness stand over here and remain standing when you get there, I'll have the clerk administer the oath. Later on.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Now, if you can take a seat.
Thank you.
Mr. Wood, you may inquire when you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Mills.
Good morning, Mr. Wood.
If you'll start us off and give us your full legal name for the record.
Sure, it's Mark with a K, John, John, Mills, Mills.
And what do you do for a living, sir?
I'm a psychiatrist, but I practice mostly as a forensic psychiatrist, which is to say that mostly I evaluate people and then testify about their mental states.
And how long have you been, well, first of all, are you a licensed psychiatrist?
Well, in most states, you're a licensed physician, and then you may choose to become a psychiatrist by doing a residency and taking boards. But I'm a licensed physician in Maryland and in Nevada, and previously in California, Massachusetts, and in D.C.
Okay. And when did you first start your career as a psychiatrist?
Well, I graduated medical school in '75, so my residency in psychiatry began then. So for the next 3 years, I was a resident and chief resident in psychiatry at Stanford University Medical School.
Okay. And if you could kind of go forward from there and tell us about your work background.
Sure. I mean, it's relatively straightforward. I was on the junior faculty at Stanford for 2 years, running the psychiatric evaluation unit of the Palo Alto Veterans Administration Medical Center. I did that until about 1980. Then I moved to the Boston area, joined the faculty at Harvard, was the intake supervisor at Massachusetts Mental Health Center, was the chief officer, which sounds very grand, but it was not like a CEO. It was really kind of a glorified administrative job. And as I mentioned, I began teaching at Harvard. I then became the Commissioner of Mental Health for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I had 32,000 disgruntled, underpaid, rather dedicated workers. It was a really very impressive agency. Then I returned to California and was the chief of psychiatry at the West Los Angeles Veterans Administration Medical Center, which was then, at the risk of bragging, the largest psychiatric hospital in North America. We had about 400 plus inpatient beds, 200,000 outpatient visits a year. I was then the director of program in psychiatry and law at UCLA, and first as an associate and then full professor there. At that point, I had my first child, Henry, coming along, and I decided I needed to get a day job that would help support the family. So I became a full-time forensic psychiatrist.
Okay. And when would that have been?
That was 1987.
Okay. And so where do you currently practice? Where's your office at?
My residence and office is in Bethesda, Maryland, and I guess you can do the math as well as I, but I've been a full-time forensic psychiatrist for 31 years now.
Do you also have a law degree?
I do.
When did you get your law degree?
1970.
Okay. And from where?
From Harvard.
Okay. Okay. And you're still full-time practicing in?
Full-time.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about the difference. What's the difference between being a psychiatrist and a psychologist?
Well, oftentimes there's very little difference. I think as a group, psychologists are better versed in psychological testing, and in some cases, in certain kinds of therapy, as a group, psychiatrists are allowed to prescribe medications. In a couple states, psychologists can do that, but generally, psychiatrists are more tuned in to medical issues that can affect patients.
Okay. You mentioned the word forensic psychiatry. Forensic psychiatry. What does that mean?
Well, forensic just means over pertaining to rhetoric. It's come to mean legally related. So forensic pathology are the people who say, how somebody was injured or worse, killed. forensic psychiatrists are those people who testify about mental states in whatever context it's relevant. It can be a criminal matter like this. It can be a matter of testamentary capacity. Did Aunt Joan have the capacity to make out that will as she did? And it can be a variety of civil suits. I mean, think about the Las Vegas tragedy, where many people were killed, or many people injured as well from the shooter. Well, those people have now, or many of them have brought suits against MGM, and MGM actually has recently gone into court to say they can't do that, but ultimately their mental state, their injury, probably be relevant.
Okay. So have you testified previously in the field of psychiatry as an expert?
Many, many times.
Would you be able to give the jury an idea of the approximate number of times you've testified as an expert?
I would say probably more than 500.
Okay. Would that be in criminal cases, civil cases, both?
Both. It's sort of like half civil, half criminal. In the criminal arena, it's about half for the defense and about half for the prosecution. It's probably more in federal court than in state court, but I certainly appear regularly in state court.
Okay. Have you ever testified as an expert previously in the state of Florida?
I have.
On more than one occasion?
Yes.
Okay. Would that be state, federal, both?
Both.
Okay. Would that be civil, criminal, or both?
Both.
Okay. Have you testified in death penalty cases before?
Yes.
Okay. And when was the last time you provided testimony as an expert in psychiatry?
2 weeks ago in federal court in Miami.
Okay.
I guess maybe 3 weeks ago now.
Okay. All right. All right. So let's. Let me ask you this too. In the times or the occasions that you've testified as an expert, have you been privately retained or testify for on behalf of or paid by the government, or how does that work?
The answer again is both. It generally is one's better compensated when one's privately retained, but many important cases, one of the parties, particularly the defendant, may be indigent, and so often I testified on behalf of state agencies or some kind of public agency.
Okay. And what is your rate in this case?
I think it's $300 an hour.
Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit more about this. We'll talk about this case. How and when did you first start becoming involved in this case?
Well, Mr. Shoemaker's office contacted me probably I should remember better, but I began working on the Colley matter in October of 17, and I think I was contacted probably in May or June of that year.
And did there come a time when you agreed to provide expert assistance in this case?
Yes.
Okay. Would that have been shortly after Mr. Shoemaker had contacted you?
Within a few weeks, yes.
Okay. And in the course of your involvement in this case, did you have occasion to receive police reports, statements, things along those lines?
Yes.
Okay. And did you at any time receive Mr. Colley's prior medical records?
Yes, I did.
And did those include pharmacy records?
Yes, they did.
Okay. And you were able to review those as well?
I did.
Okay. And at some point, did you actually come to sit down and meet with Mr. Colley himself?
I did. I met with him pretty much the entire day of October the 4th of last year, of October the 5th of last year, and then I spent about a morning plus with him on October the 6th of last year.
And did you also at any time receive any records from a Dr. Daniel Buffington?
Yes, sir.
And who do you know him to be?
I I know him to be a pharmacologist of some considerable stature.
And in the course of your involvement in this case, did you come to review materials, records that Dr. Buffington sent to you?
Yes.
And were those also likewise part of your consideration, your evaluation, and rendering certain opinions in this case?
They were.
Okay. Now, in the, well, let's, before we get into the meat of Mr. Colley's information provided to you, if you could tell the jury what medications Mr. Colley was taking. Well, let me break this up. In your review of the pharmacy records, was Mr. Colley taking various medications that were prescribed for him in August of 2015?
Yes, he was.
All right. And could you tell the jury what those medications were?
I think I have most of them at least. He was taking 2 different antidepressants, one that had been prescribed in the beginning of August, Wellbutrin, and then that was later changed to Cymbalta. These are the brand names. He was taking a sedative hypnotic called Ambien. That turned out to be quite important. He was taking and had taken bupropion. And
What is the generic word for that?
Wellbutrin.
Okay.
And it's used as an antidepressant and as a medication to help people stop smoking. And then,
Before we go on, Doctor, for the benefit of the record and perhaps for the jury as well, is Ambien known as, that's a commercial name for what medication?
I'm going to mess up the pronunciation. I always call it Ambien, Zolpidem.
Zolpidem?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, I cut you off. What were the other medications he was
Well, he
taking?
was on one of several preparations that included an opioid medication. So he was on hydrocodone, and I can't recall, there's another one, but essentially potent analgesics for neck and muscle problems that he had had, and he took those on a fairly regular basis.
Would one of them be Mobic?
Mobic is a different, it's a potent analgesic as well, but it doesn't contain opioids.
Now, and those medications were for what condition?
Well, let's run through. The Wellbutrin and the Cymbalta were, as I mentioned, antidepressants. The bupropion as well, although it can be used, it was not used here as an anti-smoking drug, it can be used as a sleep-inducing agent as well. The hydrocodone and the Mobic were used as analgesic medications to help his pain. The Ambien was used to facilitate sleep. And then he took a variety of over-the-counter preparations, LipoRush, Tonlin sensor medications I'm not particularly familiar with, but Dr. Buffington illustrated a good history of those and their usage.
Okay. Do you recall if he ever took the medication Flexeril?
No, I think he took that too. That's another non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. It looks sort of like Aleve or Advil, only a little more potent.
Now, you're a medical doctor. Can you prescribe these medications?
Yes.
Okay. And are you familiar particularly with the drug Ambien?
Yes.
All right. Are you familiar with the known adverse side effects of Ambien?
Yes.
And generally, to your knowledge, what are the known adverse side effects of Ambien?
Well, there's a phenomenon called parasomnia. Para meaning around or about, somnia meaning sleep. And the most common parasomnia for most folks is sleepwalking. But there's sleepwalking, there's sleep talking, there's sleep sex. There are a variety of conditions where people act seemingly in a rational or okay way, and yet when you later talk to them, they have no recollection. There's a dense lack of memory about what occurred, or how they were feeling, or how they were thinking. So that is the phenomenon of parasomnia, and Ambien is probably the drug most associated with people who have that potential, having parasomnias. It's also associated with memory blackouts or loss of memories more generally, even when nothing unusual occurred or when something untoward occurred. I think I said in my deposition testimony that I had a colleague and friend who fell down an escalator in Honolulu Airport. And this is a woman who was then in her late 70s, and she badly tore up her leg. Fortunately, her husband was there. Paramedics were called. They treated her. She was able to get on a plane. But the next day, she had no recollection of her injury whatsoever, except the pain and the bruising that she saw. So that's a kind of parasomnic event as well. Parasomnia meaning, again, ground sleep or sleep-associated, but particularly loss of memory.
According to the records, Mr. Colley's records, when was he prescribed the Ambien medication in August of 2017?
I believe that was in early August, that's my recollection.
Okay. And, okay. So when you met with Mr. Colley, that would have been at the St. Johns County Jail, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And did you, in order to render an opinion in this case, did you take into consideration Mr. Colley's information that he provided to you when you were meeting with him?
I did.
Okay. And did that information include Mr. Colley's recounting of what happened during the evening of August 26th throughout the morning and later morning of August the 27th of 2015?
Yes.
All right. And using that kind of a time frame, can you describe or tell the jury the information that Mr. Colley provided to you regarding that series of events during that time frame?
Well, I mean, we can talk generally about that time frame, or we can talk more specifically around later in the morning and later still. I mean, he had worked that day, he came home from school, it was his son's birthday party, as I recall. I mean, he told me a number of things that sounded pretty much like a typical evening for many folks. He went out with a buddy of his, he had some drinks, he probably around 1 in the morning did a line of cocaine.
Let me just kind of stop you there, and I want to make sure I break this down and cover it for the jury. When he, at the time that he was, or by the time he was meeting with a friend, was he with his children at that time?
No, he met his friend, I think, around 11, is my recollection, and his children had gone to bed, their young children, or then at least had gone to bed around 9, so they were.
According to Mr. Colley, do you remember if he said if there were other people at the house when he left?
Yes, there were.
And so he left the house, he meets with a friend. Do you recall where he met with the friend at?
It's in my notes, but I think he met at a bar, and then they went to another bar, is my recollection.
Okay. And you said he had been drinking. I'm assuming we're talking alcohol?
Yes.
All right. And did Mr. Colley say how much alcohol he had?
Sure. I mean, I, of course, asked that because obviously alcohol affects mental state, so it's a relevant question and an important one. And he had had several drinks at home and had several drinks with his friend, and even later, so he had drinks probably till about 3 in the morning.
Okay. And did he say beer, wine, mixed drinks? Do you recall any specifics about that?
I recall mixed drinks in the early evening and beer later in the evening.
Okay. And then, so he also told you that he did a line of cocaine?
Yes.
And
well, he didn't, pardon me, he did a line of what he thought was cocaine. I don't know if it was or not.
Sure. And do you recall when Mr. Colley, what time frame Mr. Colley provided that information?
Yeah, it was around 1 a.m.
Okay. And, all right. And when Mr. Colley had done the cocaine, was he still at the bar?
I don't recall the location. I'm not sure I asked that.
Okay. And, okay, so according to Mr. Colley, did there come a time when he parted company with a friend?
Yes.
And where did, what happened then? What did Mr. Colley say then happened afterwards?
Well, I mean, then he went over to his estranged wife's home and was hoping to see her. She was not there. He had thought that she was there because she had apparently complained was not feeling well, and that's why she didn't come over and go over to Trey's son's birthday party. And he found some sexual toys, was, I think, quite upset by his recollection. So upset that he smashed, I think, 2 or 3 televisions, LCD kind of televisions, and then he left. Came back, ran and went to another friend's house, talked to that friend briefly, may have had a beer at that point, and then came back to his sister's house where he was living.
Okay. So let's kind of stop there and kind of just freeze frame for a second. With regard to the cocaine, are you aware of, well, let me first ask it this way. Have you had occasions when you've conducted evaluations, examinations on persons who have, for whatever reason and what other different circumstances, have consumed cocaine?
Yes.
Okay. Are you, as an expert, familiar with how long generally cocaine stays in the system?
Well, it depends what you mean by that. If you mean how long is it psychoactively effective, that is it affecting mentation? I think if you do a line or two, the answer is 2 hours-ish. If you mean how long can it be detected by, gas chromatography, the answer is for a much longer period. But it's effective cognitively or emotionally for a couple hours.
Okay. So what you're talking about there, for the benefit of the jury, is there's a difference between the psychoactive effects on mental state, cocaine, but which is different than whether you could test positive if you were drug tested or something like that.
That's right. And by analogy, if you have a couple drinks, within a couple hours, probably the effects are substantially worn off if you're an experienced drinker. On the other hand, you can detect the alcohol in the blood system for quite a while.
Speaking of experienced drinking, did Mr. Colley, during your time with him, provide you any information with how frequently and how much he habitually drinks?
Yes, he did.
And what was that?
Well, he drank regularly and significantly most days. Not all.
Okay. And again, we're talking alcohol here for the benefit.
Yes.
Not talking Gatorade, but okay. Okay, so now we're at Mike Dickens, and at some point he leaves Mike Dickens.
Yes.
Okay. And the neighbor.
Correct. And I'm around 5.
Okay. And according to Mr. Colley, what then happens?
Well, now he's not surprisingly having been up all night, pretty tired. He needs to get some sleep. He knows he has a court appointment the next day. He's wound up because of what he has seen at his wife's place.
Let me just stop you there. Sorry to interrupt. You say next day. You're talking about that same day?
Later that same morning.
Okay. All right. So
good correction. And so he takes 2 Ambien,
okay.
2 half tablets.
Okay. And for the benefit of the jury, are you familiar with the pill itself? Is it, when you talk about half tablets, is it one that's got like a line, or can it be broken in half? Or
I didn't take an Ambien before, but not for years.
Okay.
And I worry about the parasomnias. But I don't recall. I just have one recently. Again, Dr. Buffington will talk about that if that's relevant.
do you recall what the prescribed dosage for Mr. Colley was at that time?
Sure, it was 10 milligrams.
Okay. And, okay.
And Mr. Colley had told me that he had broken his tablets in half, but I don't recall if they were scored, whether they had that line on them or not.
Okay. I should also ask you too, so maybe this is covered on the record. In your review of Mr. Colley's pharmacy records, medical records, the prescriptions that you provided to was it your understanding these were prescribed by doctors? These
Yes,
medications?
they were.
Okay. So now he takes the Ambien, and then, according to Mr. Colley, what then happens?
Well, according to Mr. Colley, he then slept for a couple hours, and he told me he had been awakened by his father around 8 in the morning. Subsequently, I reviewed a number of texts from him, including some texts which suggest that he was texting around 7. So even though he told me he had gotten 3 hours of sleep, I have reason to believe that either he didn't get 3 hours sleep, or he had some kind of parasomnic event around 7, or he was texting, but he had no recollection of that.
Okay. And so his father wakes him up, and then does he then leave the residence and go somewhere?
He does. He has a court appointment. He climbs into his sister's car. He leaves the residence, or attempts to leave the residence. He backs into a mailbox, dents the car, but continues driving and goes to his court appointment.
Okay. And was there any part of, try to kind of break this up a little bit in time frames, in his recollection of when he gets up and then goes to court, during that gap of time, any issues from Mr. Colley as far as memory is concerned?
Well, I think there are issues with his memory even before that, because as I just mentioned to the jury, that at 7 he's texting, and yet when I asked him what he had done from 5 until 8, he told me he slept right through it until his father awakened him. Okay. So that's the first indication that there's some effect from something on his memory. From then on, through the tragic events that have us here, he has what I would call stroboscopic memory. Like there's a strobe, of course, is an electronic flash. So when an electronic flash goes off, you see a lot because it's really bright, but then it stops going off and you don't see very much. So he has these, another way you might call it is episodic memory. He has these flashes of memory and then a period of very little recollection for a while, and then another flash of memory, and then another lack of recollection, and then another flash of memory. And that really starts on his drive to the court and continues through the events, and at some point then his memory begins to get a little better as he's driving north.
Okay. Recalling his recollection of the court event itself, did he express any problems with the strobe effect that you're talking about as far as memory? Any issues he expressed for the time frame of the court appearance?
No, I mean, he didn't give me a complete, well, let me go back. One of the issues for me in this case has been that I saw him, as I mentioned, in 2017, and obviously these events occurred significantly earlier. Between the time Mr. Colley was arrested and taken into custody, and I evaluated him, he had lots of opportunity to talk with family, friends, counsel, of course, and so that he learned a lot about what had happened, or what purportedly had happened, that supplemented his own individual memory. And at some point, those two memories, or chunks of memory, kind of merged. And at several point, I had to ask him, now, you're talking to me about what you remember, you're talking to me about what you subsequently learned and remember because you now know that's what everybody believes happened. And that's an important distinction that one has to keep in mind as I am testifying and as I asked him about what had occurred. His recollections often were, as I say, these sort of stroboscopic flashes. But now he can tell you what everybody believes happened because he's read the various reports and talked to you all and talked to family, of course.
Okay. Now, focusing now on the events at the Bellagio house where the shooting occurred, what is Mr. Colley's recollection of that set of events?
Well, his recollection is he drove up in his sister's car to the back of the property, that he had to cross over a berm or a little dirt wall, that he saw some people there, including a man, that he got upset by that he then has a recollection of going back to the car, but maybe only one or two recollections, opening, I believe, the trunk where there were a couple of guns, has a brief recollection of going towards the house, a recollection of being in the house, and then a very brief flash recollection times two of a killing, and maybe two. He wasn't sure in his discussion with me. I mean, obviously, I know there were two, but he wasn't sure what exactly his flash recollections were. He has a recollection or two of then leaving the house and then returning to his sister's house and then beginning to drive north.
Okay. And so when he drives north, as far as the narrative, according to Mr. Colley, what then happens after?
Same issue, that very few splashes of memory. He stopped at some point, obviously, for gas, but he doesn't really remember very much until after he's arrested, taken into custody. He recalls being ill for a couple of days, not sleeping very well, having a lot of excessive gastric motility, fancy way of saying diarrhea, and then his memory comes back and is normal. I mean, he recalls then events sort of as we all would, kind of more organic and not in chunks, but in more linearly.
Okay. Without getting too gross, when you're talking about the diarrhea, is there any, in your expert opinion, any connection between that issue and any of the pain medication that he was?
Sure. I mean, the narcotic analgesic, or the opioids, as we say these days more correctly, are potent in terms of causing constipation. And so when you suddenly stop them, the reverse occurs. You get the excessive motility. Very often you get emesis or vomiting as well.
And when Mr. Colley's arrested in Virginia, do you know what he was arrested for?
I don't.
Okay.
I mean, I presume there was some problem with his car, his driving or something, but there was also, I presume, a warrant for his arrest referable to the killings.
Okay. So, all right. Now, having reviewed his medical records, having reviewed Mr. Colley's pharmacy records, your awareness of the medications, specifically Ambien and the other medications, and your consideration of Mr. Colley's recollection and relaying to you of the events that unfolded on the August the 27th, 2015, do you have an opinion as to whether or not Mr. Colley was able to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of law? It was substantially impaired.
No, I believe that at the time of the events he was substantially impaired, and I think it's easiest and most likely that impairment was primarily related to the Ambien. But remember, he was taking a number of other medications. Those medications interact with Ambien and cause changes in cognition and awareness. And I believe he was suffering, and did suffer that morning, a parasomnic event that lasted, probably began as early as 7 and lasted sometime through the early afternoon at the least, probably later.
Okay. Having relayed kind of a parallel question, you talked about the psychoeffectiveness, or what happens when you take cocaine. Let's talk about Ambien. How long would the psychoactive effects of Ambien take place once it's consumed?
Okay. Well, I mean, again, obviously it depends on each person's individual physiology. Ambien is both metabolized by the liver and excreted to the kidneys, so depending upon those functions it can vary. But in general, if you take a regular Ambien tablet, there's some preparations that have sort of a soft coating and a harder inner part to make it last longer. But if you take a regular tablet, the peak plasma level, that is the highest blood concentration, is roughly 2 hours after taking it, and the half-life of Ambien is roughly 4 or 5 hours, so that within 10 hours there should be some Ambien around, but not very much, wouldn't have much psychological effect. And that's in fact why people have gone to the two-part preparation. Is early Ambien preparations, you fell asleep well, but you woke up 4 hours later and you felt kind of hungover and odd, but you really weren't fully rested. So the modern preparations have a little extra Ambien that sort of in effect brings you down gently.
Okay. And also to talk about going back to the earlier events of that morning of the 27th, you talked about Mr. Colley relaying how much he had to drink, what he had to drink, for how long, and the cocaine use. In your opinion, by the time of the shooting, of the homicides, what effect, if any, would the earlier intake and consumption of alcohol and cocaine have on Mr. Colley's mental state at that time?
It's my belief that the earlier consumption of cocaine, if indeed it was cocaine, assuming it was, it would have worn off by 3-ish. So there was essentially no effect from the cocaine.
You know about 3 a.m.?
3 a.m., correct. well before he tried to go to sleep. He may have had some alcohol with his buddy around 4:30, one beer, so that theoretically, he's an experienced drinker. That could have lasted till maybe 5:30, maybe 6. But I mean, I think by the time he woke up, the only drug that was dramatically impacting his cognition was the Ambien. Now remember, we also have the Cymbalta, and we have these other drugs on board. I presume Dr. Buffington's going to talk about that and their synergy, the lack thereof. But the Ambien would have clearly been effective after 5 a.m. or 5:30 in the morning, whatever exactly it took.
Okay. Now, in your course of this case preparation, did you review certain text messages, voicemails from Mr. Colley to Amanda Colley, or vice versa? Did you review those records of those matters?
Yes.
All right. Now, are you aware, or do you recall, for the morning of the 27th at different times, there was text communication and voicemail from Mr. Colley to Amanda?
Yes.
All right. Now, what did you take that into consideration, that information, those documents, in rendering your opinion about his substantial impairment?
Yes, I did. And, I think there's nothing in those documents or voicemails that undercut my opinion as I see it, that you can have, just like you can have that brief stroboscopic memory, you can have a period where you're coherent enough to send a text or leave a voicemail, even if you later don't remember what or why it was you did that.
Okay. All right. Just for a minute, John.
Sure.
I don't believe I have any other questions at this time.
Okay, cross-examination by the state, Mr. Johnson.
Good morning, Dr. Mills.
Good morning again, Mr. Johnson.
I want to first walk you through some of the testimony that you've given to this morning in response to Mr. Wood's questions. And I want to kind of walk us through your interview with the defendant. And as I understand, in terms of making your opinion, in this particular case, interviewing the defendant was very important. Is that correct?
That's correct, and as you heard me testify on direct, and I think it came up in my deposition as well. I spent a couple of days with him, primarily going over his life, his history, the events, all of that.
So let's go back to kind of where you started with your direct examination. The defendant basically told you during your interview with him, going back to August the 26th of 2015, which would have been the night before, he's at his house, he's with his family, and while he is there, has some drinks. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and what was it again that you said that he told you that he drank while he was there?
I can look at my notes. I don't recall. I think it was a highball of some kind, and I think he had 2 or 3 sometime between 6-ish and leaving the house later.
Okay, and your opinion today is that at the time that the murders occurred, which is around 9:30 the next morning, those would have not had any effect on him. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So he gets a text message from his friend Daryl, correct?
Yes.
And that was around, what did you say, 10 o'clock?
I think he got the message around 10. I think he met there around 11 is my recollection.
Okay. They go to a couple of bars. He has some more drinks. Is that correct?
Yes.
And your opinion today is that those drinks that he had no effect on him at 9:30 the next morning?
No, that's correct. And the only thing I would quibble with is when you say my opinion today. I think that would have been my opinion yesterday and at the time of my deposition as well. I'm not changing my opinion just for today.
And I didn't mean that way. I just want to make sure that we were clear today. So you also indicated that he told you that he had snorted 2 lines of what he thought was cocaine while he was with Daryl. Is that correct?
No, I think he told me that he snorted a line of cocaine. And I think he has told others that he has sort of one line or two, but I think he told me one.
Okay, fair enough. But your opinion is that cocaine, assuming it was cocaine, did not have any effect on him at 9:30 the next morning.
Yes.
So we get to the defendant telling you about going to his wife's house, correct?
Yes.
So he goes to her house. He goes. Did he ever tell you where he parked when he went to her house?
He may. I don't believe it's in my notes, and I probably wouldn't have asked him that.
Okay, so you don't recall him telling you where he parked that night?
Not that night, no doubt.
He didn't tell you if he parked in the driveway or if he parked around the neighborhood behind like he did the next morning, correct?
It's a fair question, and I don't recall.
Okay. So he goes into the house. He's snooping around, correct? That's what he told you, right?
Yes.
He finds the whips and the other paraphernalia, and I think the term that you used today was that made him quite upset. Is that right?
Yes.
But actually, the word he used with you was he was pissed, right?
Yes. I mean, I think they're sort of synonymous, but I was trying to be reasonably polite. I may have to change, but yes.
Okay. But he used the word pissed with you.
Yes.
And so when he found those items, he proceeded to destroy three televisions in the house.
Yes.
Now, at this particular point in time, Dr. Mills, other than the alcohol and the cocaine, he's not under the influence of any Ambien, Cymbalta, Wellbutrin. I mean, he's not in a parasomnic event at this particular point. Is that correct?
If I heard you correct, I think there are two questions there. One is the effect of the medications and or alcohol and or cocaine on his mental state, and two is a parasomnic event. I don't think he was in a parasomnic event, so I can answer that one straightforwardly. He certainly hadn't taken Ambien that night yet. That was going to be a couple hours from then forward, so he was not under the influence of Ambien. I think both Dr. Buffington and I would say that the effects of the Cymbalta and the other medications he was on, and then the various sort of non-medical pharmaceuticals for weight gain or weight loss, etc., that he was on, could have had some effect, but I don't think it was a substantial effect at that point.
Okay. The Cymbalta and the Wellbutrin, they're antidepressants, is that correct?
Yes, they're serotonin-specific reuptake inhibitors.
Okay. So they're designed to make you not feel so depressed.
That's their intent, yes.
So he also told you that while he was at the house that he knocked trash cans over, stuff like that, right?
He did.
And he took those, the paraphernalia that he found that made him pissed, he took those as proof of her affair, is that right?
Yes. I mean, again, it's important to say, at this point, she had apparently been denying the affair to him.
Okay, I'm just answering my questions, doctor. So he
Didn't mean to stray afield, but yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. But he told you that he took those items as proof, right?
Yes.
Okay. So then he goes over to Mike Dickens' house around 4:30, 5 o'clock, is that right?
Yeah, I think it's more like 4, but that's close, yeah.
Did he tell you how he got to Mike Dickens' house?
I don't recall.
Did he tell if he just walked over across the street or if he drove to Mike Dickens' house?
I stand by, I don't recall.
Okay. And so he may have had a beer at Mike Dickens' house, right?
That's correct.
And that beer, in your opinion, would not have had any effect on him at 9:30 the next morning?
I think that's right. I mean, maybe we should be slightly more nuanced. It wouldn't have had any substantial effect, but that's correct.
Okay. So he leaves Mike Dickens' house. He goes home around 5 o'clock. Is that correct? And then he didn't he tell you that before he got home he called Amanda?
I don't recall that.
You don't recall him telling you that Amanda had a conversation with Amanda? Amanda told him that we are done.
That sounds right now, yes.
Okay. And he told her that he would pay for the TVs. Is that right?
Yes, he did.
And he told you that he was concerned about the injunction that she had against him, correct?
That's correct.
The injunction that he would have just violated by going into her house and tearing up the TVs and stealing the items, correct?
Yes.
So he gets home, and you said that he took two Ambien, is that right?
2 half Ambien, yeah.
2 half Ambien. And you seem pretty certain today that he told you that he took 2 half tabs of Ambien. Is that
Well, he told me he took 2, and at that point, I didn't know enough to ask him, but he told Dr. Buffin that he...
Okay, I'm not asking you what he told Dr. Buffin, I'm asking what he told you.
Yeah, told me he took 2.
Okay, and since you bring that up, you've had a chance to read Dr. Buffington's deposition, and so you kind of know what the defendants told Dr. Buffington, correct? Are you able to say here today whether or not he took, for sure, either 2 half tabs of Ambien or 2 full tabs of Ambien?
No.
And then you said that, or maybe you didn't, but he told you that he passed out. Is that shortly after he took the Ambien?
Yes,
Okay. He used those words, passed out.
he did.
And then he slept until 7:30, is that right?
Well, he told me his father awakened him at 8. The text he wrote suggested he was texting some at 7. So I don't know exactly the chronology in there.
Let me ask you about the text, Doctor. When we took your deposition on July the 5th, so just a couple weeks ago, correct?
Correct.
And you never brought up the text in our deposition, did you?
I did not.
Okay. Did you know anything about the text?
I did, but I hadn't read them then.
But you read them here today.
I didn't read it today, but I read it over the last few days. Yes.
Sure. You've read them since the deposition.
That's correct.
Did you read all of the text?
I skimmed all of the text. I'm not sure I read every word. I doubt.
Did you look at his phone records?
I did.
Okay, and you were aware that not only was he sending texts, but he was also making and receiving calls throughout this entire time. Is that correct?
Well, which entire time, sir?
Well, that's fair. Between the time that he took the Ambien all the way up until the time he went to court.
Well, he certainly was making phone calls and texting, but he wasn't. I don't recall any calls or texts between, say, 5:15 and 7.
Okay. The phone records will have to speak for themselves, correct?
Fair. Yes.
So in your words, he's told you that he passed out. He slept until 7th. His dad wakes him up. You said at 8 o'clock.
He told me his dad was waking him at 8. That's correct, sir.
Okay. And so how did you understand he was in the bed asleep and his dad comes in and kind of shakes him awake and tells him he needs to get up? How did he tell you his dad woke him up?
I don't recall how his dad woke him up. I recall I said his dad woke him up and told him he needed to get up.
Okay, all right. So at this point, he has to go to court. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now here's a question. He told you that he had court at 9 o'clock, correct?
That's my recollection, yes.
Now, you had testified that when it comes to Ambien, the whole purpose of Ambien is to help somebody sleep, right?
Yes.
And you said that you usually take it before you go to sleep, right?
That's the plan, sure.
Right.
It's hard to take it when you're asleep.
That's right. So you take it, and you said that the half-life of it was 4 to 5 hours. Is that correct?
Yes.
Which means that it should have an effect on your ability to sleep or to help you sleep for at least 8 hours. Is that right?
No, well, I think I said the plasma peak occurs about 2 hours. So the period of greatest effect is going to be about 2 hours after you take it. By the time you get around 4 to 5 hours, and again, Dr. Buffington may know the half-life time better than I, the plasma level is clearly coming down, but there's clearly some ongoing effect at that time. I can't tell you at 8 or 10 hours if there's very much effect. I can tell you that the medication was physically reformed or reformulated because people were waking up at 6 hours out. So I think if you're taking the single tablet dosage that Mr. Colley did, probably the effects are substantially worn off, typically by about 6 hours.
But as you said, when it gets to that kind of half-life stage, it's got that little extra oomph to kind of keep you asleep. Is that right? So you don't wake up.
Well, if you're talking about the preparation he took or the new preparation?
Well, you're the one to describe. I assume that you were describing the preparation that he took.
The preparation he took, there's a take it, the plasma level comes up and then the plasma level decays. That at the plasma peak is around 2 hours. At around 4 hours, it's clearly coming down, and it's about half of what it was, and then it keeps falling. So there's less and less effect as we pass the 4-hour mark.
But the purpose of taking Ambien is to help you get 8 hours of sleep, correct?
Well, no, to help you get to sleep. I mean, I think very few physicians require that the patient gets 8 hours.
That's not part of the instructions, is to make sure that you have 8 hours to sleep?
No, I mean, I think the problem is for people who need sleep medication, they don't sleep so well. That's why they're there. And you say, look, I've got some medication that will help you, but I don't know if it'll help you sleep 5 hours or 10 hours if you're asked. My patients really ask me that. I was prescribing that kind of medication.
So they're prescribing medications just to help you sleep for just a few hours?
No. The intent is to get a good night's sleep, but it's the 8 hours that I'm objecting to. But I don't think anybody precisely measures that time.
Okay. But as you said, that it's in your body having those psychoactive effects for, and I think you said about 10 hours, it's almost gone.
I mean, there's as I say, if the half-life is 4 to 5, there's some still there at 10 hours, sure.
Okay, so here the defendant told you that he took this Ambien to help him get to sleep at 5 o'clock. That's correct, right?
That's correct, yes.
And he had court 4 hours later at 9 o'clock, correct?
That's my recollection, yes.
And did he talk to you about what his intentions were after he got done with court?
No, he told me about what he did, but I don't think I ever asked him, nor did he ever tell me about what his intentions were.
Okay, did you ever see the video of him actually coming to court?
I have not seen that. I'm aware of it, but I haven't seen it.
Did you hear the audio of when he came to court?
Yes.
So were you aware that when he came to court, he was dressed with a shirt and tie and his employee badge as if he was going to go to work?
Yes.
And so what you understand from the defendant's story to you is that he took 2 Ambien, whether it's 2 half tabs or 2 full tabs. He told you that he took this Ambien to help him get to sleep just a few hours before he had to go to court and go to work.
Yes.
So after he takes the Ambien, his father wakes him up, and then there's sort of this, I think he told you that at that point it was kind of a mad dash. He thought he was late for court, and there was sort of a mad dash. Is that right?
Yes.
And it was in that mad dash, because he thought he was late for court, that he backed into the mailbox. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And it was because of this mad dash that his father had to take his children to school, because he wouldn't have had time to do that himself and then get to court. Is that right?
That's my understanding, yes, sir.
Okay. And so he goes to court, is that right?
Yes.
And he handles his business at court.
Yes.
And all of that is on recording, correct?
Yes.
And then he leaves court, and what did he tell you he did after he left court?
I'm not exactly sure. I think initially he headed home, and I think he made some phone calls and some texts, and I think he then went over to his late wife's house, or his house, where she was.
Now, during one of those phone calls that he made after he left court, he told you that he talked to Amanda for about 18 minutes. Is that correct?
No, I don't think he told me the duration of the phone call. I mean, that may be the duration, but he told me to spoke with her for a while, and they discussed, whether she had talked to the police, which she had, and he was upset by that, but he decided to go over.
Would take a look at your deposition, refresh your recollection on that.
I don't have my transcript with me, but I'm sure.
Any approach what insurance you made? I want to be fair to the adopter, so I'll show you a copy of your transcript. Page 36 and lines 12 and 13, if you'll take a look at that.
Okay, I see it there.
Okay. Does that refresh your memory?
Well, that's obviously what I testified to. It doesn't refresh my memory. I don't remember the 18 minutes.
Okay. Okay, you testified in your deposition that what he told you was he talked to Amanda for about 18 minutes.
So be it.
So during that conversation, the defendant told you that Amanda Colley reassured him about the TVs, but said that she had already called the police. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Said she was trying to fix it, correct?
Yes.
And then he told you in response to her telling him that he felt that she was trying to fix it. Why did she call the police? Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then he said that he needed to give her a check for the TV. Is that correct?
Yes.
So he leaves, so he goes home from there, correct?
Yes.
And that's the house that he lives at with his sister, is that right?
That's correct.
And he goes for, does he tell you what he does when he gets to the house?
I don't recall.
Okay. Did he have any memory of what he did at the house?
I mean, I think I was moving on to the next event, which was the main event, sadly, but I don't recall.
Okay. So he goes home, and then he goes to Amanda's house, is that right?
Yes.
And from there, you said that he parked, not in the driveway of the house, but he parked at a house sort of behind, in the neighborhood behind their house, right?
That's correct.
And did he tell you why he did that?
No. Well, let me correct my answer. He may have told me, I don't have a clear recollection, that he was concerned, given the fact that she had called the police, that they might be there. That he didn't want to walk in on them if they were there, because he was obviously violating the restraining order.
Okay.
So I don't recall that, but that may be what he told me.
Okay. So he talked to you about the injunction that he has that kept him from being supposed to be going to her house, right?
I was aware of the injunction. He explained it to me. Yes, sir.
So he knew that because of the injunction by itself, he was not supposed to go to her house, right?
That's correct.
And so now he's told you that Amanda told him that she had called the police. Is that correct?
Yes.
And he's told you that he went to her house anyway, but because he thought the police might be there, he decided to park in a place that was concealed, correct?
Yes.
And it's there, after he gets out of the car, that he walks across this berm in the back of the yard. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's when he sees a man.
Yes.
Now, he told you that basically he was there to give her a check, right?
Yes.
For the TVs.
TVs, plural, 3.
So now, as I understand, and of course at this point, from what I understand your testimony, he's got this strobe-like memory from this point forward, correct?
Well, no, I think in fact that the memory is like that, or episodic if you prefer, really from 7 o'clock-ish on. That when he doesn't recall to me, he did not recall to me, the phone calls or the text that he had made that morning and that I subsequently learned about when I looked at the texts.
Okay, well, he's standing here in the backyard. He remembers that, correct? And he remembers turning to go back to the car.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And he remembers opening the trunk. Is that right?
Correct.
Did he say why he opened the trunk?
I didn't ask him. I think at that point I was asking what happened next. You know, keep telling me what you remember.
Okay. He told you, though, this wasn't his vehicle. It was his sister's vehicle, right?
Yes.
Did he tell you what was in the trunk?
At least 2 guns.
Okay. Did he tell you that he knew the guns were in the car?
I don't think I asked that, but obviously he did know that because he went back and opened the trunk.
Okay. He didn't tell you he got the guns from, the front passenger seat, correct?
He did not tell me that.
He got them from the trunk.
That's what he told me, sir.
And then he gets the gun and goes back to the house.
Yes.
And when he sees the man through the window, that makes him upset, doesn't it?
Yes.
Now, going back to these guns he got from the trunk, Isn't it true, Dr. Mills, that he told you that it was just dumb bad luck that those guns were in his sister's car?
He did tell me that.
Just dumb bad luck.
That's what he told me.
So he gets the guns from the trunk of the car, dumb bad luck. He goes back to the house. He's already seen the man that's made him upset.
Yes.
And then the next thing, he's in the front of the house with a gun in his hand. Is that correct?
I don't have him in a location. I have him, he's in the house with a gun in his hand.
May I approach it with Sean?
Good night. 37. 13, 14. Showing your deposition from a couple weeks ago, Doctor. If you look at page 37, lines 15 and 16 and 17. 15, 16, 17.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what I did agree to in the deposition. But I don't have, as it did here now, a clear recollection that he told me he was in front.
Okay. This was a follow-up from a statement you had made that he had a clear memory of being in the house, and I had asked you, was that correct? Make sure I understood you, and you said yes. Is that correct?
Yes.
So he's up in the front of the house, and he has a gun in his hand, correct?
Yes.
And then he told you that he jumped over a fence, ran through a door, and then that one when he blacks out. Is that right?
Yes.
And again, at this point in time, he's got that episodic strobe-like memory going on here.
That's what he told me, yes, sir.
He shoots through the glass door twice, correct? That's what he
Yes.
told you. Then he's in the bedroom. He's yelling at his wife. That's what he told you, correct?
That's what he told me.
His wife is yelling. She's reaching for the gun. That's what he told you, right?
That's what he told me.
And then someone's in the closet. He sees a gun in their hand, and you're not sure if he's referring to Amanda or Lindy at this point. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then he sees blood. That's what he told you?
Yes.
And he told you he had two guns. Is that right?
Yes.
The two guns he got from the trunk of the car.
That's correct.
He also told you during the course of your interview, did he not, Doctor, that he made the statement, I was always a little hot-headed, always the alpha male. He told you that, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
And then he leaves, he goes back to his house that he lived at with his sister, right?
Yes.
And that's when he got the AR-15.
That's correct.
And then he told you that he said, I got to go, got to go. Correct?
Yes.
Meaning that he had to flee the area.
Yes.
And then he's driving on the highway. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, Dr. Mills, you talked about a lot of things that you reviewed in this case. But isn't it true, Dr. Mills, that the only source of the information that James Colley actually took, the Ambien or any of the other medications, was James Colley himself? Is that correct?
That's correct. You asked me that at the deposition, and I said the same thing.
Okay. That's the only source of that information?
Right. I mean, no one took the blood level from Mr. Colley. We don't have anybody else who saw him take the medication. So far as I know, that's correct.
Okay. The only source of the information that he took the medication as prescribed was James Colley. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the only source of the information that it had any effect on him whatsoever is from James Colley, correct?
I think that's substantially correct.
And so, Dr. Mills, your opinion here today that the defendant was suffering a parasomnic event at the time that he killed his wife and Lindy Dobbins rests substantially on what the defendant told you concerning taking the medication, how much he took, and the effect that it had on him, correct?
On that and upon the fact that it was prescribed and that he told me he was taking it as prescribed, and on the fact that a variety of other medications were prescribed, which could and I believe did interact with the Ambien. Yes.
Okay. Let me ask the question again, because I think the answer might have been lost in what you just said. You had records that said he was prescribed these medications, correct?
That's correct.
But whether or not he took them as prescribed and he had any effect, the source of that was based solely on his testimony.
His statements to me, yeah, was the testimony.
His statement, correct.
That's correct.
So your opinion about the fact that he took the medications, took them as prescribed, and had effect, rests almost completely on what he told you, correct?
That's correct.
And if he told you a lie, and he didn't tell you the truth, that would adversely affect your opinion here today, correct?
That's true.
That's further your honor.
Any redirect, Mr. Wood?
Yes, briefly. Your Honor. Going over a couple of points that Mr. Johnson made, you were told that he backed into a mailbox
Absolutely.
and that he dented the car as a result of that.
I was, and I believe it.
Is that consistent in your opinion with impairment?
Yes.
Now, when Mr. Colley was at the house where the shootings occurred, did he describe anything that we would call a panic attack?
He did. Early on, he told me about feeling just dread and anxiety when he first approached the house.
Okay. What are we talking about from a medical perspective when we're talking about panic attacks?
Well, it's not exactly clear, but I mean, in general, we're talking about a fight-flight reaction, a big surge of adrenaline or epinephrine, if you prefer, and feeling very jittery, and he describes feeling very jittery and frightened.
Okay. Now, you've, in your profession, in your experience, practicing medicine and psychiatry, you prescribed Ambien for patients before, is that correct?
Many times, sure.
And do you ever advise your patients to take Ambien knowing that you're going to have to get up in 2 or 3 hours?
Never.
And from a medical perspective, why is that not a good idea?
Well, as you heard me say, the peak plasma level is around 2 hours, so if you knew you're going to get up in 2 hours, that's when its effect is the greatest. And as both from my clinical work and from my forensic work, I've come to appreciate that taking Ambien has real risks of parasomnic events, of lack of memory, when you talk about falling down escalator event, that there are risks associated with it that make me think it's a drug I would not want to prescribe in general.
Okay. All right. Thank you, doctor. Appreciate it.
Any recross, Mr. Johnson? No, Your Honor. Dr. Mills excused, Mr. Wood.
I'm going to have him stick around, Judge, for future rounds.
You are relieved from the witness stand, but not excused.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate the distinction.
All right, folks, we're going to take our lunch break at this point. Exactly. I'd like to remind you during the lunch break, please do not discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anybody else. Don't do any research of any type, and leave your notes here in the courtroom, and they will be secured during the break. It is, as I mentioned, precisely noon. Let's have everybody back at 1:20. It's 1:20 back in the jury lounge. And as soon as we have everybody gathered up, we'll get you all in and continue on. Thank you, folks. Enjoy your lunch. Anybody else remaining in the courtroom? What do you have for the afternoon? What do you have lined up?
Judge, our next witness is going to have to be Dr. Quiroga. It's Quiroga. First name is Michelle. I don't know the exact order, but I have lay witnesses: Gail Dickens, Marie Robert Isaac, John Wright, John Schwinghammer, Frederick Cartwright, Jason DeLoach, April Ayala, and maybe Mr. North and Chris Wright, depending on how we're doing on time frames. Just so you know, my preference would be for certain strategic reasons. I'd like to see we get up to the point where I would next call Ms. Wright. I'd like to call her after Dr. Buckner, who cannot be here today. He's going to be at 9 o'clock in the morning. So I might be asking the court for just a slight, if we finish a little bit early on that issue. FYI, we had some rescheduling of Dr. Meadows' deposition, which is going to be done at 5 o'clock today. So anything along those lines would be helpful too.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, because I didn't realize y'all had a deposition at 5 o'clock. Okay, sounds like we'll have enough witnesses to occupy most of the afternoon.
If we get that far, then I'll only have 2 people left for tomorrow. They'll be done in the morning, and that'll be whatever the state wants to go.
Okay, very well. Stand will be in recess until 1:20. So everybody enjoy your lunch.